We shall not be moved. We shall not be moved, just like a tree standing by the water. We shall not be moved. The Union is behind us, we shall not be moved. The Union is behind us, we shall not be moved, just like a tree standing by the water. We shall not be moved. We're fighting for our freedom, we shall not be moved. Fighting for our freedom, we shall not be moved, just like a tree standing by the water. We shall not be moved. We're building a mighty union, we shall not be moved. Building a mighty union, we shall not be moved, just like a tree standing by the water. We shall not be moved. We shall not be moved. We shall not be moved, just like a tree standing by the water. We shall not be moved.
On September 8, 1883, at Gold Creek in Montana Territory, a crowd of foreign dignitaries and politicians, including former President Ulysses S. Grant, watched as railroad magnate Henry Villard pounded the last spike in the Northern Pacific Railroad line connecting St. Paul, Minnesota with Puget Sound. The Industrial Revolution had arrived in the Pacific Northwest, igniting the region's economy and creating an untold number of jobs. Workers poured into the region by the thousands, but instead of the security of a steady job, workers found poverty-level wages, crushing hours, and dreadful conditions. So they protested, picketed, and struck. They sang in the streets, troubadours with a cause, and they bled. Struck down in cities like Spokane, Everett, and Centralia. And at the battle's peak, they shut down a city. 65,000 workers, men and women, standing together, united. It was intended as a blow against exploitation, a fight for dignity and pay equity, a precursor to revolution. It was the Seattle General Strike. For 6 days in February 1919, Seattle was closed for business. Virtually all businesses and all but the most essential city services shut down. America and much of the world watched as workers struck for a living wage, for reasonable hours, and for the right to organize. The working class stood up to capitalist and government forces and walked off the job. This is their story, the labor wars of the Northwest.
This was a time where, not just in Seattle, but across the United States, and for that matter, the Western world, a vibrant economic change and growth.
The Pacific Northwest was rapidly expanding in the 1890s, 1900s, 1910s. But we don't see the large industries like you see in Chicago or New York. You know, there's not huge factories, where women would be working by the thousands.
The Yukon and Klondike gold strikes propelled Seattle to new economic heights. Between 1900 and 1910, its population tripled to over 237,000, bypassing Portland as the region's largest city. City leaders embarked on civic improvements, beginning with the massive regrade of downtown to expand the commercial district. In 1909, they hosted the Alaska-Yukon Pacific Exposition, Seattle's first World's Fair, permanently linking its fate with Alaska. 5 years later, the 42-story Smith Tower opened, making Seattle the home of America's tallest building outside of New York City. Its grandeur symbolized Seattle's emergence as a vital metropolis and permanent force in global trade. But much of the success came on the backs of the working poor.
as more and more workers are going from farms or going from being independent craftsmen into the factory, they start using the term wage slavery because it has some cultural currency.
Workers coming and settling in Washington State and Seattle often had high hopes. They were going to find great jobs, and wages were higher in the West than they were elsewhere. That's one of the big reasons for coming. But then prices could be higher too. So there was often disappointment over what the working conditions and wages were.
Well, part of the problem is that the cycles of good times and bad times were hellaciously close together in the Pacific Northwest.
Nowhere were the inequities of the wage earner's plight more apparent than in logging. Workers were pawns in a boom or bust, go for broke world. Hired when needed and fired when not, they were taken off the board without apology. Logging camps were populated by young, single men, mostly European immigrants drifting from camp to camp. One logger wrote to his wife that, "The grub is fair, but the bunkhouses are packed like sardines." Uneducated and undervalued, they worked 12 to 14-hour days for as little as 20 cents an hour. And danger was everywhere.
I think serious studies have said that working in the logging camps in the early days of the Pacific Northwest settlement and industrialization was as dangerous as being in the front lines of a war.
When thinking about a guy who was going to spend his life in the woods working, I think there was an understanding that there was a certain amount of danger that each individual would face on a daily basis, and I think they saw it in what would happen to their coworkers each day or each week, each month. There was bound to be at least one injury, one death, one dismemberment, some sort of skull-crushing injury.
And that is maybe a bit of an exaggeration, but if you looked at the broad picture, not so much. It was a horribly dangerous way to make a living, and what you had was an influx of humanity. Immigration patterns meant that there was a vast supply of individuals, in many cases, who didn't even speak English, who could find their ways into the woods, and if they were strong and lucky, could make a living doing that.
Talk about fallers for starters. So a guy who's employed as a faller, first off, he's expected to basically produce 2 logs a day. And we're talking pretty big stuff here. Old growth logs that would be in the neighborhood of 4 feet at the small end to 8 feet, 10 feet in diameter. And bringing those things down required, they had to get up on springboards. They had to put a notch in the side of that tree, get a springboard attached, and then stay elevated while they're using their axe to put in an undercut, work their way around to the back side of the tree, take a back cut, and then get that tree on the ground. So you're working under a tree that's 400, 500, 600 years old, and they have what the loggers referred to as widowmakers. Those are your dead limbs that are kind of hanging above you. And a widowmaker, a limb of old growth tree size, is in its own right, hundreds of pounds per limb. Had that fallen, it could crush a guy. A crew of guys who are employed as boom men who work out on the mill pond area. So this is the area right in front of a sawmill where you've got your chute that's bringing logs up into the head rig. Those guys worked with no life jackets, in tidal water, standing on rotating logs that had a tendency to want to spin you off into the water. And their balance was their best friend, certainly, but their ability to get those logs moving in the right direction so that they could keep production up was of course the demand put upon them by their job. But the danger of drowning was a very real thing for those guys. So bringing a log into a mill was, again, came from the mill pond up a chute. You got a conveyor chain that's dragging those logs up into the head rig area. You've got a carriage, which there's a man who rides that carriage back and forth, where you're taking slab cuts off the log with bandsaws. There was danger at every point of that process. There were no safety guards that kept flying debris away from workers. There was no real real good way, or at least there hadn't been a way developed to protect workers physically from that machinery.
While sudden death awaited the logger, shingle weavers faced a slow death, one digit at a time, to say nothing of the clouds of sawdust that invaded their lungs.
But on a regular, daily, mundane basis, people sacrificed their fingers and their hands and their arms into the machinery in shingle mills. Shingle mills were a deadly, dangerous way to make a living. You were aspirating acrid sawdust that eventually would destroy your respiratory system and condemn you to an early death from some sort of upper chest infections that the cedar asthma would eventually get you. So those trades were different than working in the woods, but equally grim.
The demand for labor opened doors for workers from all over the world, but it wasn't an even playing field. In the seesaw economy, minorities were usually the last hired in good times and the first fired in bad. It was a dual labor system: higher paying, skilled jobs for whites, unskilled and dangerous jobs for people of color. African Americans first arrived in the Northwest in great numbers, working for the railroads as porters, baggage handlers, and waiters. They generally found service jobs in the cities or on the docks, where they gained recognition as hard workers. Employers often recruited African Americans to break strikes. In 1888, desperate owners hired hundreds of veteran miners from Virginia and Kentucky as substitute or scab labor in central Washington. Lumber companies, too, needed experienced lumbermen and turned to loggers in the American South to work the forests in eastern Oregon. Lafayette Lucky Trice and his father moved from Alabama to Maxville, Oregon. They were among hundreds of men working side by side with white loggers in the forests of Wallowa County, an environment fraught with risk in a racially charged time in an all-white town.
African American men were hired by the Southern Pine Lumber Company in that industry of timber and logging more than any other industry in the South. They were experienced, and they moved millions of board feet in the South. And they wanted to start this operation the same way. And so they really toyed with the idea of not just having a lumber town with just men, but one with families and schools and a baseball team. So when these folks moved here, in some of the interviews, they were asked, why would you move to a place you don't know about that's so cold and so different? And part of it was the laws, and the Jim Crow in the South was so much more severe. There were over 3,000 of us hung from trees, and not necessarily for any good reason.
Oregon, where racial exclusion laws from the mid-19th century were still on the books, presented challenges for African American loggers. Segregated housing, lower wages, and an active Ku Klux Klan were all facts of life. But in a rough and tumble logging business, operating in the harsh winter weather of eastern Oregon, townspeople relied on everyone to do their part, regardless of color.
Brings that question of, well then, how'd they get away with, number one, bringing black people into Oregon when it was illegal for them to live and work here? And how is it they stayed and the Klan didn't bother them? But if you'll look again, it's about industry. That if the Klan interference will affect the money coming into the townships, they're not going to allow that to happen. I conjecture that they were not allowed to mess with operations. Really, it was about this timber industry in the middle of nowhere that with 25 below zero, 5.5 feet of snow, it was rugged. And I equate that to being in a wartime situation where you're pulling men from all different walks of life and you're putting them in a situation where their environment is hostile. And they're essentially on the same side, but maybe back home, sitting in their comfort, They can make up rules, but when you're in the middle of nowhere, you have to watch out for each other or you don't survive it.
Native peoples also struggled to secure a place in the Northwest economy. Federal policy pressured them to adopt the ways of white society and to abandon their culture. That meant they were expected to join the Industrial Revolution, which in the early industrial era meant farming or learning a trade. The Bureau of Indian Affairs operated boarding schools where young natives were taught a trade.
As for becoming industrious people, they were industrious already in other ways. They were fishermen, they hunted, they gathered. So learning to farm was a new idea. I would have to say they embraced it, but at the same time they were forced to. They didn't have a choice. The government punished parents who didn't send their children to the boarding school. They were punished with fines or put in jail. So the kids had to learn these new trades, and farming for people was different. They did, however, succeed in the lumber mill, logging, and fishing was a big industry for men on the reservation. There was a lumber mill at the boarding school, and I think just because Tillett people have always been carvers, it was something that was innate to them, going out to the forest and logging. A lot of the Tillett people weren't regular employees. They were kind of not even contract. They would show up to work, they would do the job that was needed, and they would get paid by the Indian school. So it was like clearing a road or building a dock, building a building, or paving. So that was a lot of the labor on the reservation at the time revolved around the Indian school.
Finding meaningful work presented obstacles for another minority group in the Northwest, the Chinese, Japanese, and other Asian immigrants. They too faced discrimination and hostility. They too dealt with expulsion whenever they crossed picket lines or worked for lower wages. The federal government eventually neutralized a perceived threat with passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, literally slamming the door on all Chinese attempting to enter the United States.
Chinese started arriving in the Pacific Northwest in the late 1800s. There were conditions in China that drove them here: poverty, war, famine. So they were looking for a way out, and at the time the Pacific Northwest was a developing area. Soon America started becoming known as Gold Mountain. Chinese called it Gimsan because that was the place that they were hoping to make their fortune and then return home to China to support their families. And so that's how it got started. So we tend to forget the struggle and the hardship that was exacted on these workers. They also often worked for less money than the white workers under more dangerous conditions than what the white workers would take. During the time that the Chinese were here working on these very back-breaking jobs, they faced a level of discrimination that was, by any standards, amazingly harsh. There were discriminatory laws. They were subjected to violent racial attacks. They were lynched. They were driven out of settlements or beaten. Many, many incidents that were just terrible.
Expulsion created problems for employers because they needed Chinese labor, especially in the region's thriving fishing and canning industry, when Northwest salmon fed middle-class families in the U.S., Australia, and much of Europe.
That was a huge industry, both here in the Pacific Northwest as well as up in Alaska. And so they needed thousands of workers to work processing the food, catching the fish, cutting the fish, canning it, cooking it, and so forth. And so the industry turned to Asian laborers. Chinese formed a huge part of the labor force, later Japanese Americans, Filipino Americans as well. There was a patented machine developed called the iron chink butchering machine, specifically developed because the industry wanted to both mechanize and speed up the process, as well as to get rid of the Chinese laborers, who were not a desired group in that climate of racial discrimination. So they created this iron chink butchering machine, that's the patented name, as a way to get rid of the Chinese. The irony is that
you still needed laborers to operate the machine. The term is obviously a racist term, but it also kind of gives you a clue of what the role of the Chinese was in the actual industry.
There once was a union maid, she never was afraid of goons and gangs and company things and the deputy sheriff who made the raid. She went.
Men weren't alone in battling workplace inequities. Women, too, struggled for fairness and recognition. At stake was their independence, the right to make their own decisions, and their very survival.
Work in this period would be characterized by long hours and pretty uncomfortable conditions. We saw in a cannery strike that happened in Portland in 1913 that the women went on strike not just for better wages and shorter hours, but they wanted things like a lunchroom, a dressing room, clean aprons, clean towels. So sanitary issues were pretty big for women at this time, as well as hours and wages.
By 1920, half of Americans were living in urban areas. And this is a well-known fact, but what tends to get lost in that urban history is the importance of women to the city and the city for women. Quite often the received wisdom is that cities were scary places for women and they needed to be very careful when they were out in the streets. Something that's probably not so familiar to contemporary ears is the importance of reputation and being respectable. And some of this was related to class issues, some of this was related to being responsible in a sense for your family.
Women working in service industries, faced a lot of difficulties in the workplace. Things like sexual harassment would not be uncommon, working very long hours, not having any kind of stable hours or incomes. A lot of jobs were seasonal or temporary, and those would all place difficulties on women. And women worked, in a variety of places that we wouldn't think of as traditional workplaces, such as women working in prostitution during this period was, an avenue for women to support themselves if necessary.
An equally large, and probably really closer to half of women were working in pink-collar jobs. So these are jobs such as working in sales, so working in the department stores, working in service, a category that included people that were doing domestic work, and this was a huge category at this time. It was still really the largest cluster of what women were working in the early part of the 20th century. So this was particularly true for African American women. Half of African American women worked. It probably really was more than that because the official statistics are not necessarily correct on these sorts of things. And 80% of African American women would have been working as domestic workers.
Few women worked harder for working women than Alice Lord, who founded the Seattle Waitresses Union in 1900. Waitresses worked 10 to 15 hours a day, 7 days a week, for $3 to $6 a week. To draw attention to the woes of waitressing, Lord marched from Seattle to Olympia in 1900 to testify before the state legislature. The next year, the state enacted a 10-hour day for women.
So what this means is better working condition for waitresses, but I do want to add that it was for white waitresses. Alice Lord was wonderful in a variety of different ways. She was a great organizer, but she was an exclusionist. So the union was all white. This meant that black women, that Asian women were not part of this union and therefore didn't receive the benefits that came along with union membership.
The wages in general were pretty low during this period. Women, for example, in 1913 in Portland, the city did a study that estimated that a woman needed $9 to $10 a week to support herself. That's not counting any family that she has to support. But women were regularly making $1 or less a day. And so when they were looking for a raise in wages, they were looking for $1.50 a day to try to make it up to that minimum that would help support women and their families. It was difficult for married women because they were kind of looked down upon in the workforce, as in they didn't have as much freedom from responsibility, but they also didn't have things like access to, good, reliable childcare while they were at work. And so you see, in some workplaces, women would kind of set up systems to help support each other if there was family emergencies that arose. But women were really working without any of those protections, having to go to work very soon after giving birth and having to, take care of their families in whatever way they could. So working women who had children and families were definitely at a disadvantage.
Solidarity forever, for the union makes us strong.
Industrialization created untold wealth in America, but it also created a staggering gap in income equality. At one end were America's richest: manufacturers, merchants, landowners, and financiers. At the other was the working class, and a life teeming with uncertainty.
As men and some women joined unions, they did so partly because they could stand taller. It gave them some control, negotiating control over their jobs, some sense of we're not just powerless in this economy where most people did feel powerless. And the unions offered not just a chance to raise one's wages and improve working conditions, but also increase one's dignity. The unions organized on a promise: you join with us and we together can change things. So there are two union movements that arise certainly by the teens, 19-teens. There's the radical industrial workers of the world, and then the not so radical, but often, often socialistic unions of the American Federation of Labor. The AFL organized around craft lines. If you're a plumber, you're part of one union. If you're a carpenter, you're part of another union. They did so because they had found out and believed that solidarity followed work, that people of a similar trade naturally would combine together and consequently could be a stronger union, could win strikes, keep the discipline. And that promise was to not only organize all the skilled workers there, but also the unskilled workers. And the IWW was also much more inclusive on race and gender principles than the AFL.
So many workers were drawn to the IWW for its radical ideology. Many were also drawn to the IWW because they had this very inclusive idea that all workers should belong to the union. And at that time, trade unions, craft unions, usually only represented native-born white men. Very few women, very few African Americans, and very few Southern and Eastern Europeans belonged to craft unions.
IWW said that's wrong. We believe in organizing the entire working class, regardless of origin, regardless of race, regardless of gender. And so they tried to build these much more inclusive unions, which were also operating on a different political principle. The IWW practiced revolutionary unionism. They believed that they were not just fighting for better wages, not just fighting for better working conditions, but to overthrow capitalism and create a new economy based on syndicalism or socialism.
Because the IWW gave women empowerment, it gave them kind of freedom within a much broader ideology to work on women's issues in a way that wasn't limited to a women's auxiliary, it wasn't focused just on suffrage, it wasn't focused just on progressive reform. Women could take the philosophy of the IWW and kind of use it to work towards what they found to be most important.
So the IWW, in the preamble to their constitution, declared that the working class and the employing class have nothing in common. And between these two classes, a struggle must go on until the workers of the world come together as a class, take control of the means and the machinery of production, and share all the good things in life.
Employers saw themselves as benefactors, visionaries who built an enterprise from scratch, and with that, a town. They believed interfering in free enterprise not only hurt workers, but the town itself. Dozens of strikes in Washington state alone disrupted business operations for 2 decades and tore at the fabric of the community. owners went to great lengths to maintain control of their business and protect the flow of profits.
Armed strikebreakers who sometimes had backgrounds as professional wrestlers, professional boxers, sometimes college football players from the University of Washington, from the University of California, got recruited, brought in to violently break strikes.
What started as a typical conflict between capital and labor evolved into something more fundamental: the free speech rights of workers. The free speech fight, as it became known, spread across the region between 1909 and 1919. City officials throughout the Northwest struggled to cope with legions of wobblies who invaded their towns, opened up meeting halls, and railed in public against the injustices heaped on the working class.
So during free speech fights, a wobbly would put down their soapbox, immediately climb up on the soapbox and declare fellow workers. And sometimes they would get 1 or 2 or maybe 3 sentences into their speech, and they would be hauled down by a police officer or quite frequently a vigilante. But the second they were hauled down, another wobbly, another free speech fighter would climb on that same soapbox or maybe their own soapbox and do the same thing. You can imagine the frustration of the police or of other anti-IWW forces that as soon as they haul somebody down from the soapbox, there's another person ready to go.
By the end of November, Spokane police had made nearly 800 arrests, and as the IWW intended, completely disrupted law enforcement, city administration, and the courts. Other cities learned from Spokane. In Aberdeen, rather than jail the troublemakers, they herded them out of town at gunpoint. On a rainy November night in 1911, sheriff deputies ousted dozens of men with warnings to leave and never return. Police may have been able to silence wobbly speeches, but the protesters had a more powerful weapon at their disposal: music. Few things rang louder than a chorus of men and women belting out wobbly ballads from their Little Red Songbook. Many were written by labor activist Joe Hill, who fought for worker rights from Vancouver to Tijuana. Known as the Troubadour of Discontent, Hill was falsely accused of murder and executed in Utah in 1915. Music is just a powerful tool, right? It's used for all kinds of things, from romance to propaganda. And so Joe Hill was somebody who recognized this is going to be a powerful part of what we do. The strategy used by labor is the age-old tactic of a lot of folk cultures, where you take an existing melody and you rewrite it to a new situation, to create new meaning or to address a new situation that's been created. So, music is a key.
One of the most stalwart men I ever met and could call a friend was Frank Bliffer, who was left dangling at the end of a rope in Butte, Montana, after the strike there on Anaconda Hill.
Labor activist Ralph Chaplin, writer, poet, and artist, also evoked the power of music to rally workers. Born in Ames, Kansas in 1887, his radicalization took seed at age 7, when he saw a worker shot to death during the Pullman strike in Chicago. He joined the IWW and fought for coal miners in the bloody Paint Creek Mine War in West Virginia in 1912. During World War I, he was among 100 activists arrested for violating the 1917 Espionage Act. He would serve 4 years of a 20-year sentence for his opposition to the war and the draft. A longtime editor of national and local union newspapers, Chaplin would settle in Tacoma, Washington, until his death in 1961. He's buried at the Calvary Cemetery in Tacoma, where activists gather each Labor Day to sing his songs and rally workers. Chaplin's most enduring legacy is his music, and the labor movement's iconic ballad, Solidarity Forever. It's sung to the tune of the Civil War ballad, Battle Hymn of the Republic. Like many wobbly tunes, it was played to compete with the Christian minstrels, the Salvation Army Band. The story starts in Spokane, in the Northwest, where the Salvation Army was sent out into the streets to counteract the protesters. And so they were going to drown them out with music. And the protesters responded by creating their own lyrics to the same songs and then singing down the Salvation Army. So it's actually a really funny and creative example of appropriation, right? We're going to take your melody and we're going to create something new to drown out your message. In the Sweet By and By, an old hymn was changed into The Preacher and the Slave. So they changed In the Sweet By and By, in that glorious land of the sky, to You Will Eat By and By.
Long-haired preachers come out every night, try to tell you what's wrong and what's right. But when asked how about something to eat, they all answer with voices so sweet. You will eat by and by, in that glorious land above the sky. Work and pray, live on hay, you'll get pie in the sky when you die. Oh, the Starvation Army, they play, and they sing and they clap and they pray, till they get all your...
So the free speech movement in Spokane created several colorful characters, not the least of which was Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. 19, 20 years old, sent from Chicago by the IWW, helped to support the strikers in the free speech movement. She'll get arrested. She'll accuse the police of using the jail as a house of prostitution. She'll chain herself to a lamppost to avoid her arrest. Really helps to disrupt the whole movement. It builds sympathy for the movement. Women, especially in Spokane, will begin to show some sympathy for the strikers and for the workers. She'll go on to write a book called Sabotage. Joe Hill, the labor activist, songwriter, musician, will write a song about her called Rebel Girl, and she'll be known there forever as the Rebel Girl.
We've had girls before, but we need some more, and the industrial workers of the world. For it's great to fight for freedom with a rebel girl.
In Everett, Washington, in 1916, the free speech fight led to the bloodiest conflict in Northwest labor history. Over the previous decade, the city of Smokestacks had grown into one of the nation's leading lumber producers. Dozens of mills, an iron factory, shipyards, paper mills, and a vibrant downtown contributed to the sawdust economy, fostering a strong pro-union sentiment. The city staged elaborate Labor Day parades, where shingle weavers, electrical workers, machinists, cable car operators, paper mill employees, painters, and dozens of other unions marched proudly down Hewitt Avenue. But typical for timber, prosperity didn't last, as frequent contractions led to layoffs and wage cuts. In May 1916, shingle weavers walked off the job, inflaming already heated labor relations. The IWW, with its messages about slave wages and one big union, now turned its sights to Everett. Like other cities, Everett passed a public speaking ban, leading to the now familiar routine of arrests, fines, and expulsions. Sheriff Donald McRae, a former shingle weaver, showed no sympathy for strikers. He considered Everett his town and would not allow what he called boxcar revolutionaries to disrupt it. For 2 months, downtown streets roiled in a cauldron of protest and violence. Police and special deputies delivered justice with rifle butts and axe handles. Anyone attempting to speak in public or disrupt business was roughed up, arrested, and sent packing.
Well, actually the IWW were fairly well behaved to begin with. When they first started speaking, they actually were speaking 50 feet back from the street corner. And they were trying to decide exactly what to do, because they're dealing with fellow workers, shingle weavers, who essentially have been locked out of their jobs, who are in dire economic straits, who are at odds with them.
Events turned ugly on October 30th, when dozens of Wobblies rode the ferry from Seattle to stage a rally. Sheriff McRae had gotten word of their arrival and was determined to stop them in their tracks. He deputized dozens of men, nothing more than armed vigilantes with a badge, and waited at the city dock.
There was a vigilante group out there, as well as the group that McRae was in charge of, and what you had essentially was a systematic beating of the IWW, who were then driven out of the county on the interurban railway right-of-way. It was, I think, at that point, shocking to people in Everett that it had reached that kind of level of systematic brutality. Using clubs that had been manufactured in a local mill specifically for the purpose, little batons that could be used to beat people. And of course that was the famous interchange that turned up later in court under oath, that when one individual told McRae that he had constitutional rights, McRae said, "Not now, not here, you're in Snohomish County, and we determine what your rights will be."
The attack served only to embolden the IWW. Determined to exercise their constitutional rights, more than 300 men, mostly down on their luck laborers who wanted to support the cause, steamed towards Everett on two ferries, the Verona and Callista.
By that time, many of them are actually injured. They've been beaten. They've been they're convinced that when they come back to Everett, they're not going to be empty-handed. In fact, at that point, a number of them determined that they'll be carrying guns, and they're not going to go peacefully to a remote spot to be beaten senseless by McRae and these goons.
As the Verona steamed into Everett, some 200 deputies and vigilantes lined the docks, hid in sheds, and waited in tugboats around the harbor. Hundreds of onlookers gathered on the surrounding hillside.
The scene at the Everett City Dock was a crossfire of people who'd set themselves up on coal bunkers. It's hard to tell how much of this McRae was even in control of anymore.
They were making ready to put the gangplank out for those on board to go onto the dock. And Don McRae appeared in the dock. Now, don't ask me which hand he held up in the air, but he held one hand up in the air. I saw this, and I heard these words: "Who's your leaders?" The reply came from the boat: "We're all leaders." He says, "You can't land here. You can't land here." See? He turned, his hand still in the air, and faced, his hand at his waist. And I do remember seeing a gun in the holster there. I am not certain, but there was it. And immediately, as though that were a signal, first a single shot was fired. And within the time it takes to take a breath, a volley came from the dock.
Well, her bow line was tied, which meant that when the shooting started and all the passengers on the foredeck ran to the starboard bow, she probably would have capsized, would have just rolled right over. But in fact, the bow line was tied, so what happened was it arrested the roll of the ship. But a number of individuals went into the water over the rail because of the steep angle that the ship pitched when everybody ran away from where they thought the gunfire was coming from. They eventually snapped the bow line and pulled back out. But by that time, of course, they'd been in the crossfire for a little while. And actually, the people in the dock area in the Everett Harbor didn't stop shooting when the Verona pulled back out. One individual was seriously injured by rifle fire when the boat had already pulled out into the harbor, and people were taking pot shots at it from quite a distance away. We're guessing probably officially 7 dead, but probably considerably more. There were bodies that wound up in the water that never were officially recovered.
As the Verona headed back to Seattle, they passed the northern-bound Callista and warned them to turn around.
The people of Everett in the immediate aftermath of the shooting were essentially, at that point, you get the impression, almost hiding in their homes. You had a vigilante squad that was marching the streets and breaking up any gatherings of people. It was almost a kind of an ad hoc martial law situation.
When the Verona docked in Seattle, waiting police arrested 74 men. Prosecutors decided to try the IWW leader, Thomas Tracy, first. Held in Seattle, the trial lasted 2 months. After 13 hours of deliberation and numerous ballots, a jury acquitted Tracy, requiring prosecutors to drop the charges against the 73 others. Most of Everett believed the Wobblies got away with murdering police, while the IWW said the tragedy confirmed the thuggery, evil intent, and smugness of industrialists who could murder with impunity. No one shooting from the docks on that bloody Sunday was ever indicted.
The time bomb that had been building throughout those months in 1916 finally just reached a point where the leadership on both sides had sort of placed all of their constituents in a situation without a graceful place to back down.
America's entry into World War I in April 1917 took the spotlight off Everett. The region boomed as defense industries sought raw materials to conduct the war and feed the troops. Shipbuilding exploded as 41 shipyards in Washington and Oregon produced nearly 300 ships throughout the war. Military recruiters had a heyday as more than 100,000 men from Washington and Oregon enlisted in the armed forces. People of color and women found jobs vacated by men at war. The Northwest economy was rolling. Good economic times and patriotic fever led to an even stronger suppression of free speech. The wage earners' cause was no match for a war in which America intended to make the world safe for democracy. Opponents were labeled disloyal and aiding the enemy. Multiple alien and sedition acts, enacted under the Woodrow Wilson administration, gave the federal government sweeping powers to fine and jail anyone obstructing the war effort. Progressive causes, especially labor, were seen as hindering the war. By putting their needs ahead of the brave boys fighting in Europe, strikers were being unpatriotic.
But the federal government in 1918 effectively promised the shipyard unions that once the war was over, they would renegotiate and allow wages to increase. But at the very end of the war, the shipyard board changes its mind. They're basically getting ready to shut down the shipyards, but they're not saying that. What they do say is no wage increase, and that sets off the prelude to the Seattle General Strike.
The war's end ushered in a deep, nationwide recession as wartime spending ground to a halt. The sudden decline in demand caused wartime industries to lay off workers. 15,000 lumber workers in Washington and 7,000 in Oregon lost their jobs. Longshoremen, who had been promised a raise when the war ended, cried foul when owners reneged. It's in the context of this post-war economic turmoil that we can make sense of the Seattle General Strike. The first general strike in U.S. history. It began when 35,000 shipyard workers walked off the docks on January 21st over unfair wages. Their numbers swelled to 65,000 when multiple local unions joined the cause and staged sympathy strikes. For 6 days, Seattle came to a standstill, with all but the basic services shut down.
So they appealed to the other unions, the 110 other unions represented by the Seattle Central Labor Council. They asked the other unions to support the shipyard workers in a solidarity strike, a general strike designed to stop the city of Seattle. They want to shut down all of the work that makes the city move in order to put pressure on the federal authorities and the shipyard owners.
110 out of the 125 unions joined the strike. 65,000 men. And they organized everything from milk stations for mothers of babies to every conceivable thing.
People were afraid of losing essential services. I mean, that's a legitimate fear. Who's going to turn on the electricity for the hospitals? What kind of essential services are we going to have? And who's going to collect the garbage? These were questions that came up before the strike and during the strike. And again, people feared the worst.
After all of that, on February 6th, at 10 o'clock, the strike is in force.
Streetcar workers, waiters, barbers, waitresses, store clerks, newsboys, warehousemen, railroad workers, and scores of others put down their tools and walked off the job.
And the labor movement was very careful and cautious in planning this. They knew that strikes often fell apart because of violence, because of clashes with authorities or others. So they asked union members to basically stay home, not to be on the street. No big demonstrations, raucous noises. And they deputized about 200 returning war veterans. They called this the Labor Veterans Guard, who then patrolled the streets and asked people to stay calm and stay quiet because they didn't want to cause any possibilities of clashes with the police.
The mayor of Seattle in 1919 was Ole Hansen. He was sometimes known as Holy Ole, a bit of a clown, not highly respected by the Seattle business elite, a typical politician, on the make, on the take, willing to use this event to further his own political career. Ole Hansen tried to play a legitimate role initially, took part in the negotiations between labor and management, but when labor refused to back down, when they held to their goals and insisted on this strike, he walked out. Ole Hansen walked out and immediately called the governor and warned him that there was very likely going to be a general strike, and he wanted them to call in the National Guard.
The mayor asked for federal troops, and on the first day of the strike, troops from Fort Lewis entered the city and took up positions at the National Guard armories and at other stations. The labor movement had miscalculated. It had spent a lot of time thinking about how it could run the city. But in the course of all that planning and negotiation, the labor movement didn't fully account for the hostility, particularly on the part of the mayor and the major newspapers. So by the time the strike had started, even though it turned out to be quite peaceful, the opposition to it, the fear of it, was really palpable. And the mayor in particular, who had been labor-friendly earlier in his career, came out militantly against the strike, demanded that the labor movement call it off, and threatened martial law if they didn't do so. The labor movement didn't call it off. Hansen didn't have authority to declare martial law, but his vehemence in opposition was something that the labor leaders hadn't counted on, and it became a big problem.
One guy that I talked to was in the center of the strike. His name was Haverty, wonderful Richard Haverty, an old man. Told me that what got him was the unearthly quiet, how quiet it was throughout the city. There was nobody talking, there was nobody at the public library, there was nothing. It was just total calm.
In the course of what turns out to be a 6-day strike, there was no violence. And interestingly, there were almost no arrests of any kind, and no arrests that seemed to be related to the strike. So the concern about violence, which had been on everybody's mind, turned out to have been resolved very favorably. Because the Seattle General Strike was followed worldwide. Newspapers around the world were riveted during those 6 days, wondering whether Seattle was on the verge of revolution or what was going to happen. And within, not the first day, but by day 2, there was some waffling on some of the unions. The strike started on a Thursday. On the weekend, some unions said that they were going to authorize their members to go back to work. On Monday, there was a lot of people going back to work. On Tuesday, they called off the strike.
Nothing changed after the strike. The workers went back to the places where they worked and asked for their jobs back. It broke a lot of those 110 unions. The employers refused to sign another contract with them, saying, you broke your contract, now you pay for it.
And in the aftermath of the general strike, there's not a sense of defeat on the part of the AFL unions, the Central Labor Council. Instead, there's a sense of, look, we just pulled off this amazing thing, a completely nonviolent statement of solidarity on behalf of some workers, all the other workers. So most of the leaders of the Seattle labor movement counted this as quite exciting and a stepping stone to what they thought would be a still stronger labor movement to come.
General strikes are one step away from revolution, and that was scary. The press was no friend of the strikers. Labor had one friend in Seattle in the press, and that's the Seattle Union Record. Anna Louise Strong of the Union Record would also pay a price for her activism. She'll be arrested after the strike, specifically for the column she wrote in the Union Record comment, which was this kind of dog whistle for revolution. Where is this thing going to go? And that was scary. So she'll get arrested. They will drop the charges, and Anna will go to Russia, where she'll write several books supporting communism, and eventually get in trouble there and move to China, where she will become a friend of Mao Zedong and live until her death in 1960.
The IWW did not manage, they didn't control, they weren't in any way the dominant force behind the Seattle General Strike, but they took a lot of the heat for it.
The IWW appears to have played only a peripheral role in the strike. Looking for someone to blame, authorities raided the union's Seattle headquarters, arresting 39 Wobblies.
One of the good things about the strike was the lack of violence. It was a peaceful strike. The organizers worked very hard and sent the word down the ranks that there were to be no violence, there were no demonstrations, there was very little picketing. It was a peaceful affair, and I think the credit goes to the labor movement for that.
Events in Centralia, Washington would soon take the spotlight off Seattle. Located along the Northern Pacific Railroad tracks, the city operated as a hub for the farming and logging industries. The presence of an IWW office downtown was a gnawing reminder of their opposition to the war and their participation in the general strike earlier that year.
So it's the responsible townspeople, most of whom belonged to the Elks, that decided it was time to run the Wobblies out of town. So April of 1918, they come out of a parade, attack the hall, take everything that's in the hall, throw it out in the street, burn it, with the exception of a desk that was auctioned off and a typewriter. There was later on an attempt to burn that building.
Seldom backing down from a fight, the IWW returned to Centralia in September 1919 and opened a union hall on the ground floor of the Roderick Hotel on Tower Avenue downtown. Soon, rumors of a planned attack reached the Wobblies. They suspected it would come on the first anniversary of the end of World War I, Armistice Day, November 11th, when the city parade was planned. They were determined not to be railroaded a second time.
Wobblies even went to the point of soliciting legal advice. They went to the point of appealing to the citizens with written statements, asking for citizen help. They got none of that, but they did ask the one attorney in the community that was sympathetic to the wobbly position, Elmer Smith. They asked him what their legal status was. Could they defend the hall? And unfortunately, he advised them that not only could they defend the hall, but left them with the impression that they could do it from outside the hall.
Assuming that they were within their legal rights, the Wobblies armed themselves. They lined men up at the front window, armed men. They had other men across the street in an upper floor of a hotel, as well as behind the building on Seminary Hill.
The parade got underway at 2 o'clock, moving north along Tower Avenue. Hundreds of spectators lined both sides of the street. But this classic American scene in a small American town was suddenly interrupted when several Legionnaires and Army veterans broke ranks and veered towards the Roderick, not suspecting the presence of armed men waiting both inside and outside the hotel.
So one of the things about Centralia was a very patriotic town in a very patriotic time. And there's a parade, and people are celebrating, and all of a sudden, coming up the rear, the Legionnaires and some veterans pulling up the rear, veer off, break ranks from the parade, and head to the IWW offices.
Now that was probably the worst mistake that was made. And if you look at it from the two sides, both sides being correct and both sides being wrong in what happened.
The shooting started when the attackers smashed in the door and broke windows. Wobblies positioned at the windows, including the radical labor activist Wesley Everest, shot into the mob. Hearing the gunfire from inside, the men across the street and on Seminary Hill joined in the gunfire, killing 3 Legionnaires and wounding several others.
So what happened within the hall itself when the shooting started, it became apparent rather quickly that there were guys in the hall that were both armed and unarmed that didn't want anything to do with it. I mean, when it really went down, they wanted out of there. Now, Wesley Everest, he was a militant from a long way back for good reason. He had been treated badly in a number of incidences. He was willing to take a stand and die for what he believed, and that's why he was probably willing to kill as a part of that taking a stand. And as Everest comes out the back and around the corner into the alleyway, he runs into 2 Legionnaires that are coming the other way. He shoots both of them. They both go down. He then turns and he's making his escape, and he's escaping north out of Centralia, headed for the Skookumchuck River and hoping to cross the river. Well, he gets into the river realizing he's wearing heavy boots, but he makes the decision that he's not going to swim this river in November with a pair of boots on.
With the posse quickly approaching, Everest, with a long-held mistrust of law enforcement, decided he had no choice but to surrender.
And Wesley Everest says, if there's law enforcement amongst you, actually he says, if there's a bull amongst you, I will surrender. Hubbard continues to point the gun at him and walk towards him, so Wesley Everest shoots Dale Hubbard. Dale Hubbard goes down. Wesley Everest shoots him again. Then he shoots him again. That point, if you really look at it from a legal standpoint, Wesley Everest probably could have made the argument that he was acting in self-defense because he was being pursued by rabid mob. But the second time he shot, the first time he shot a man that was down, that was murder. The second time he shot him, that was murder twice.
Deputies subdued Everest, beat him severely, and dragged him to the Centralia jail. As night fell, Centralia began to rage. A call went out for 50 deputies to round up the remaining Wobblies, and more than 200 showed up. Worried events were getting out of hand, Centralia Mayor T.C. Rogers requested help from the National Guard. It arrived too late to help Everest. Vigilantes cut off power to the jail and then stormed in, demanding that the lone deputy on duty hand over his prisoner. They hustled him outside, forced him into the back seat of a waiting car, and drove him to a bridge over the Chehalis River.
The essence of the story is that when they got to the Mellon Street Bridge, they threw a rope up over one of the girders and put it around his neck and shoved him over the side. And the story is that that didn't kill him, didn't break his neck, So they pulled him up, put a longer rope on it, and kicked him over again, and that snapped his neck and killed him.
The crowd roared as the enraged men repeatedly shot into the swinging corpse. Participants in the lynching were never questioned or prosecuted. The Mellon Street Bridge, forever known as Hangman's Bridge, was replaced in 1959.
There were 6 men dead. 3 of them died immediately. They were Legionnaires. The 4th one, Dale Hubbard, of course, Wesley Evers is number 5. He dies later that night. And then 2 days later, the deputy sheriff that is shot in a search outside of Centralia, and it was a friendly fire between 2 elements of the search party.
The trial was relocated to Grays Harbor County from Centralia because there was no chance of them getting a fair trial in Centralia. Blood was running high, people were upset, and it turns into a media circus, kind of the 19th century version of the O.J. Simpson trial. And it had colorful defense attorneys as well. A man by the name of George Vanderveer defended the Centralia defendants, and he, throughout his career, will defend over 100 Wobblies in various trials, including the Everett Massacre trial.
The trial of the Wobblies, presided over by Judge John Wilson, became a full-blown media circus. Most locals saw the shootings as nothing short of a ruthless slaughter of innocent men. The fact they intended to destroy private property was beside the point. Nothing justified murder, and in their mind, the IWW was a prime evil, and evil will thrive when left unchecked. Among those who testified was Legionnaire and World War I veteran Eugene Fitzer, who was shot in the leg during the gunfire. Prosecutors indicted 11 men, including Elmer Smith, the attorney who had advised the Wobblies of their rights to defend their property under the state's Stand Your Ground laws. Following 47 days of conflicting testimony and sensational news coverage, the jury took 2 days to reach a verdict. They acquitted Smith and another defendant and found a 3rd man guilty but insane. 8 defendants were found guilty of 1st or 2nd degree murder. The jury found 1 defendant guilty of murder in the 3rd degree and recommended a light sentence. Judge Wilson informed the jury that there was no such charge and was in no mood for leniency, handing out sentences from 25 to 40 years.
Justice was swift. Interestingly, Elmer Smith, the attorney, he will be charged with conspiracy to commit murder. He'll be one of those that is acquitted, but nevertheless, he'll spend the next year defending himself. He'll also then dedicate the next many years of his life helping the Wobblies that are convicted, that are in prison, get shortened sentences.
One of the things I suppose that the labor movement struggles with right now is I don't know that it really has a sense of itself and its potential. That we have narrowed our understanding of what our historic task is to just good jobs and wages and benefits, that we've kind of reverted back into the old sort of bread and butter unionism of a century ago.
While the labor wars of the Northwest were a low point for the movement, it would reach new heights in succeeding decades. Major victories in wages, hours, workplace safety, and retirement benefited tens of millions of working men and women of America. The 1955 merger of the American Federation of Labor and the Congress of Industrial Organizations created something like the IWW vision of one big union. That year, 37% of American workers belonged to a union. But it's been a long slide downhill ever since, and by 2016, union membership sank to less than 11%. In recent decades, growing anti-union sentiment and a score of state laws and Supreme Court rulings have awakened workers to a harsh reality. Gains made in the past may not prevail in the future. Today, a younger generation of workers are fueling a new form of militancy, as they look to their violent past for answers in shaping a peaceful future. To keep labor history alive, leaders in Washington gather each Labor Day at the grave site of Ralph Chaplin and his wife Edith in Tacoma to honor his contributions and sing his music.
Oh, you can't scare me, I'm sticking with the Union, I'm sticking with the Union.
I think the IWW had it figured out a long time ago when they said an injury to one is an injury to all. And then acted on it, that it's not just like a catchy slogan. As working people, and our history of struggle is that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. You know, an injury to one is an injury to all. We're all leaders. Working class and the employing class have nothing in common. Like, those aren't just good slogans, but that they help frame our understanding for who we are, what the reality of the situation is, and like concretely like what we need to do, how to go forward.
And what we have to learn to do is to democratize their capital. 1 billionaire, 1,000 millionaires.
We are students of history, many of us. And we look back on someone's life and give thanks. Ralph was one of those persons, and so was Edith. And their life was very important to us. He went to jail. He was a wobbly. He was a worker in our unions here in the state, in the city of Tacoma. So it's good to remember him and give thanks for what he has done for us.
Read a history of the state of Washington and I dare you to show me a strike. Go to Centralia, go to Everett, go to Aberdeen, across the hump to Yakima. Ask them, anybody there that's gone through school or high school, did you ever have any strikes in this state? No! Labor didn't make history. Labor didn't improve these conditions. Men didn't give up their lives for this cause. Only the stuffed shirts, the big shots, if you please. When you see the story of the IWA in one volume, complete, you're going to read one of the most amazing stories that was ever put down in little black marks on white paper. Because labor must remain organized. Either that or go under. And now goodbye, thank you a lot, and God bless you.
So be with us now. Bless us. Bless our work. And be with us now and forever. Amen. And we'll sing the hymn at the end of this right now. Solidarity forever.
When the union's inspiration through the workers' blood shall run, there can be no power greater anywhere beneath the sun. And what force on earth is weaker than the feeble strength of one? Oh, the union makes us strong. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Grab those hands. Solidarity forever. For the union makes us strong. There is aught we hold in common with the greedy parasite that would lash us into serfdom and would crush us with its might. Is there anything left for us but to organize the fight? For the union makes us strong. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. For the union makes us strong.
Is it we who plowed the prairies, built the cities where they trade, dug the mines and built the workshops and the miles of railroad laid? Now we stand outcast and starving amidst the wonders we have made, but the Union makes us strong. Solidarity forever, solidarity forever, solidarity forever for the Union.